Wayward Magic, Chapter 8. Answers and a Story. It's raining by the time we arrive at the farm. We're all cold and wet. Me, the girls, and our horses. Traveling at night is difficult and dangerous enough when the weather's good. With the rain, the torch that I had borrowed from the inn stable yard sputters, and the feeble light it casts out wavers in the rain. But Tam moves with purpose and confidence. Somehow, despite the dark night and poor visibility, she still seems to know where she's going. She seems to know exactly where she's going. We walk the horses from the dirt road we'd been following and cross past an old rotten fence line onto the farm property. You know, Cressa grumbles, it was nice and warm back at the inn. And dry. Did I mention it was dry? A few times, Cressa, I sigh. And I've already told you this is less than helpful. And I have already told you, Tam adds, that the inn was no longer safe. The town was not safe. According to who? Cressa asks. According to the strange, addled old woman who imparted wisdom and knowledge by grabbing your wrist and staring into your eyes? How is that even possible? And are we supposed to trust someone we just met? Someone who leads us from some place that was nice and dry and warm, throws us out into the rain and leads us to a creepy old farm where thousands of Emperor's guards might be waiting inside? They could already be waiting to snatch us up and throw us in a cell for the rest of our natural life. I turn to her and sigh. Well, that's very... Or they could simply kill us outright, Cressa adds. No, Tam says firmly. We will be safe here. I felt it. Come on, the farmhouse is this way. The farmhouse, which I could barely make out in the distance, looks as run down and decrepit as the rest of the farm. It looks as if no one has lived here for years, perhaps decades. Yes, Cressa says, smiling. Lead on! This way, to our deaths. Great, now the sarcasm is catching. The darkness hides me from them as I roll my eyes and shake my head. We leave the horses in the yard just outside the farmhouse and watch as Tam walks right up to the front door and knocks. Wait, I say. It might be... The door opens almost immediately. Standing in the doorway is a girl, smaller and younger than even Tam. She's perhaps 12 or 13, wearing a plain dress of pale blue, and smiling. Just smiling, looking back and forth between the two girls and me. And then I hear it. No, that's not quite it. It's not something I hear, because she's not saying anything. Not out loud, anyway. Her mouth never opens, and her lips never move. Tam, Cressa, Raven, enter and be welcome. I am Dara. Mother Sophia will greet you shortly. And she steps aside and waves us in. Tam, Cressa, and I all share a look. Apparently, we all heard the same thing. As we step inside, Cressa whispers, well, that's a nice trick. Dara just continues to smile. I will stable your horses in the barn. Come, get warm. We have food and fire. If this is a trap, Cressa adds with a tired smile, it's the most welcoming one I could imagine. As I look around, I see that Cressa is right. For a moment, I've been so thrown off by Dara, the smiley little telepath, that I miss the fact that the inside of the farmhouse looks nothing like the outside. The interior of the farmhouse is actually well kept, bright, warm, and cozy. Cressa takes a deep breath. And as tired as I am, at this point, I don't even care if it's a trap. Food, a warm fire, then death. That sounds most wonderful. Oh no, Dara thinks at us with a sincere smile. No death. You are safe here. Only food and fire. And a bed if you wish it. But first, let's talk. The voice jolts me for a second, actually hearing it spoken out loud instead of popping in my head. We all turn and see the old woman from the inn. She gives us a knowing smile. I am Sophia. Thank you for trusting me. I wasn't sure if you would. Well, I knew that Tam would. That much I could feel. And I was hoping you would as well, Raven. I'm sure you have questions, so let's help you three all dry off and get warm, and perhaps a little food while we talk. And it's not long before we're seated at a comfortable table, eating toasted bread and cheese with Sophia. So, Sophia says, questions. Let's start with Dara. I raise an eyebrow. Are you reading our minds? Sophia chuckles. No need for that. You three are rather obvious. Of course, I could read your mind, but it's considered rather bad manners to just jump in and begin prying without asking. And again, I don't need to. So, Dara, how does she do what she does? I ask. I'm not even sure how to word it. Sophia nods. I call it pushing out. If there's a proper term for it, I don't know it. You push your thoughts out, and a receptive mind can pick them up. Dara is mute. She was born that way, it seems. It makes for a hard life not being able to communicate. Dara's parents abandoned her when she was young, although she's not sure if it was because of her inability to speak or because she was blessed with magic. Tam sniffs. Cursed with magic, more like. Sophia nods. Ah, yes, the whole magic is wayward and all that. Well, I can't blame you. We are a product of our environment, our parents, where we grow up, what we're told, what we are taught. And if we hear it said enough, then we begin to believe it ourselves. But eventually, as we grow, we must learn to make our own decisions, yes? Decide for ourselves what we believe. So, staying on Dara for a second, I say, trying to steer the conversation. You found her and taught her how to communicate with her mind? So that means you can too, right? Sophia simply smiles. You already know the answer to that one. I nod. Okay, but you had to have already known that Dara was able to touch magic before you taught her how to push and receive thoughts, correct? You can't take a non-magical person and teach them to touch magic, right? Correct, Sophia replies. So that means she has powers beyond the ones that you've taught her. Sophia nods. Dara is an impressive young girl. Not quite as powerful as you two. She looks back and forth between Cressa and Tam and gives a little shrug. I did do a little prying when I took hold of Tam's wrist back at the inn. I picked up your names and a little more besides. Sorry about that. But yes, Dara is able to do some things that before I met her, I wasn't sure could be done with magic. For one, she can heal. Heal what? Tam asks. Injuries, illness. Well, Sophia says cautiously, it's hard to say. In the past, she's healed herself of minor cuts and scrapes, the kinds of things you might get working on a farm like this. I twisted an ankle once, and Dara was able to just massage the pain away. Could she fix something bigger, like, say, a broken bone? Maybe. Or a wound that could kill? I have no idea, and I'm in no hurry to find out. But I do know that simply being around her makes other people feel better. Myself included. Age has taken a toll on me, but when I'm around Dara, my breathing improves, my joints ache less. I'm not sure how she does it, honestly, and Dara is unable to explain it in a way that makes sense to me. She simply says, I heal, and smiles at me. Tam turns to me. Have you met other girls who can use magic in such a way? I give a little shrug. I've heard of girls who could heal, but I've never met one that does it just by being near them. Sophia gives me an appraising look. But you have met other magic users. Besides these two, I mean? Yes, that makes sense. Odd, isn't it, how the magic affects girls in different ways? It's not something I've been able to figure out either. Which leads me to another question, I say. You're obviously very protective of Dara, and understandably so. So when you hear word that someone is in town looking for her, why did I seek you out, rather than simply hiding her away from you? Sophia finishes. 2 reasons, really. First, you are already traveling with 2 magic users. I can feel when someone around me is able to touch magic. These 2 are so strong I felt them the instant you 3 rode into town. That got me curious, so I watched you for the first 2 days, and it became obvious very quickly that they were not being held against their will. I narrow my eyes. How exactly did you spy on us for 2 days without me noticing? I'm usually pretty careful about not allowing that kind of thing. She chuckles. Well, I can't give away all my trade secrets. Just know that you did nothing wrong, Raven. In fact, you made staying undetected more difficult for me than normal. In any case, once I knew that these 2 trusted you, I decided that Dara and I could trust you as well. What's the second reason? I ask. You said there were 2 reasons why you decided to trust me. Sophia nods. Someone dressed like you came here, to the farm, roughly 6 months ago. An armed woman with a sword dressed in black. Her name was Scarlet. Called herself a Knight of Krell. She was only here for a short time before moving on. But she proved herself to be someone I could trust. She said to be on the lookout for another one like you. She said that if I could trust her, then I could trust you. Except she wasn't gathering up magic users the way you were. She had another mission, she said. And did she say what that mission was? I ask. I got the impression she was trying to reach out and connect to other ladies such as yourself. Sophia replies. She seemed to know that you, or someone like you, would be passing through here before long, but she said that she was unable to stay to wait for you. She had to move on. She was, however, confident enough in the fact that someone such as yourself would be coming by that she left a message to pass on. Then she smiles and adds, assuming you are, in fact, another Knight of Krell. I give her a little smirk. You could just read my mind and you'd know for sure. Sophia chuckles. True, but I don't think I need to. What was the message? Sophia pauses just an instant, but the hesitation is there. Her message was just 2 words, easy for me to remember, but she said that before I tell you, you need to know the things that I know. You need to know the things I told her. You need to know my story. Because she believed that once you hear it, it may affect your plans. And then, once you hear her message, you will know exactly what you need to do. I consider this quietly, then nod. Okay then, tell me your story. It is not a story I like to tell, Sophia says quietly. So if you don't mind, it's a little easier with a nice cup of tea. She gets up and heads over to the hearth, and a few minutes later she brings us all a small steaming mug of tea. At this point, Dara is back from outside, gently shaking the rain from her poncho and cloak. Dara doesn't care for tea, Sophia says softly, but she'll listen to the story. Won't you, Dara? Dara simply smiles and sits down on the floor, tucking her legs beneath her. So, Sophia says, my story begins like so many women and girls in this area. I was able to touch magic, obviously. You already know that part. But unlike some poor young ones, my parents actually protected me, sheltered me. They didn't believe in that wayward nonsense. I catch Tam's eyes dropping a little at that. There were several of us in the village. My friend Olivia could make things float. A girl named Tashi could predict the weather. She knew when rain was coming days in advance, down to the minute. And then there was me, of course. I could get inside people's heads. I could read thoughts and emotions the way Tam can, and I can push out my thoughts the way Dara is able. Dara smiles just a bit wider at the mention of her name. Pride, perhaps, in her abilities. If I am careful, Sophia says quietly, I can make people think or believe things, or make people not see someone who is following them. She hides her smile behind a sip of tea, and I return her smile. Very clever. Growing up, Sophia says, we didn't let people outside the village know what we could do, of course. But inside the village, we believed we were safe. The people in the village protected us, hid us, and so, unlike so many others like me, I was able to grow up. Sophia pauses and takes another sip of her tea. I take in a moment to sip mine as well, and damn, no idea what's in here, but this is easily the best tea I've had since I got here. Sophia catches my wide-eyed reaction and cracks a tiny smile. I just shrug. Sophia, this tea is incredible. Tam nods, sitting down a half-empty mug. Quite. Sophia's smile brightens. My mother taught me how to make it. Her smile softens. And I taught my daughter. And my granddaughter. When Cress's eyes turn toward Dara, Sophia shakes her head. No, not Dara. Although I'm old enough to be her grandmother. I didn't meet Dara until much later. My own daughter was born, raised, and lived her life in the same village as me. She grew up, fell in love, married. I never felt a spark of magic from my sweet, kind Violet. But Violet and her husband had a child. They named Sonia, and Sonia was a strong child. I could feel that right away. I don't mean that she could touch magic as a baby. I don't mean to imply that. But I could tell right away there was something special about her. Sophia sighs, sips her tea, stares at the cup for a moment before continuing. But then, illness swept through our village, taking away my sweet Violet and her husband both. Sonia was still just a baby. She grew ill, but survived somehow. Life is cruel and random that way, I find. Some live, some die, and no one can really say why. My own husband had passed on long before, so I raised Sonia on my own, a grandchild that became my second daughter. I raised her in the same house that I grew up in the same village, a village called Breetown. Cressa gives Sophia a curious look. I've seen many of my father's maps, but I've never heard of Breetown. Sophia studies her tea for a moment. It was too small to show up on most maps. It was just a tiny village in the west. Was? Tam asks. What do you mean by was? With a heavy sigh, Sophia says, Breetown, the village where I grew up, and where I raised a daughter, and a second daughter, it no longer exists. We all sit in silence, completely unable to respond to that, until Tam, bless her heart, asks, How is that possible? The Emperor's Guard, Sophia says simply. It takes her a moment to continue, another sip of tea and a far-off look. This was years ago. Sonia was 10 years at the time, younger than these two girls here, younger than little Dara even. One of the youngest I'd seen show an ability to touch magic. That little girl was as sweet as her mama, as kind and honest as her da, and she showed the same ability to touch magic as her old gran here. Well, no, not the same as me. As we know, it's very different from one girl to the next. My sweet Sonia could control the air, much the way Cressa here can control fire. Enough to lift her off the ground a little. Quite the sight that was, the little girl floating through the air. Of course, it's almost impossible to tell how magic will pass from one generation to the next, because so few magic-able women make it to childbearing age without being captured or killed, or having their magic burned out of them. Sophia took another sip of her tea. Well, anyway, one of the girls in our village, about 14 or so, was traveling over to a nearby town, delivering something for her father, when she was stopped and accosted by a member of the guard. He attempted to rape her, and she fought back. She used no magic, did nothing, but push him away and slice his arm with a small knife. While he was distracted with pain and anger, she grabbed a rock and bashed him in the head. He fell unconscious, and she ran. She ran directly back to our village. I cannot fault her for that. She was afraid, and she thought that she had killed the man. Never mind the fact that she was in the right of it all, as she had only used violence in defense of her own body, as is allowed by law. But alas, she did not kill the man, and so the man with the bleeding head and arm was able to track her. He marched directly into our village the very next day, along with about a dozen of his companions, all armed with swords, bows, and spears. We were a small village with no posse or lawman of any kind. Our village council had always been enough to handle any squabbles or arguments between the families there. And so, when the members of the guard stormed in and demanded the arrest of the young girl, there was no one to stop them, except laborers, craftsmen, farmers, and women. Did they take the girl? Tam asked quietly. Worse, Sophia replies, her eyes focused on her cup of tea. They accused her of touching magic. She protested. She said she only fought back in defense of self, as is allowed by law. She even explained to everyone how she used the knife and the rock against the man. But of course it was her word against the bleeding man. He didn't want to admit that he had been bested by a mere girl. So he said that she had used magic against him, skipping entirely over the part where he attempted to rape her, of course. He demanded her immediate execution. The men and women of the village protested. The families of our village had, for decades, secretly protected the girls and women who could touch magic, don't forget. Several of us knew that the girl had shown no signs, although we couldn't tell them that without admitting how we knew. Several of the men of the village tried to stop the guardsmen, and they were knocked aside and beaten down for their trouble. We were not armed, not with real weapons, and had no real way to stop them. They dragged the girl to the town square, pushed her to her knees, and drew a sword for her execution. There's a pause as Sophia takes a long, ragged breath. My little Sonia was born with so much love in her heart, so much like her mother. She looked at me as we watched what was happening, and I felt her struggle. She wanted to fight back. I'm not sure what she planned to do, blow the man holding the sword over with a giant gust of wind, perhaps. But I pushed out to her with a single thought. No. Because I knew what would happen if Sonia exposed the fact she could touch magic. She would face the same fate as the girl on her knees waiting to die. But, as I said, the girl on her knees couldn't even touch magic. Sophia locks eyes with me, and I see that her eyes are red and rimmed with tears. But the girl being accused did have a sister. A little sister, maybe 5 or 6, I don't recall. young enough not to know any better, young enough to not understand. And so, as the older girl knelt and wept in the dirt, and the man in blue cloth and leather armor raised his sword above his head, about to strike, the little sister screamed. She screamed and screamed, staring straight at the man with the sword, and we all watched. We all watched as the man with the sword suddenly burst into flame. We watched, silent and horrified, as he dropped the sword, fell to the dirt, and died without a sound. The little sister was still screaming, right until the moment one of the guardsmen drew his bow and fired an arrow into her chest. Sophia looked away and blinked, and the tears that were welling up fell. That was when the entire depths of all the hells in the world broke loose. She sighs and looks at her mug and sets it down. I should have chosen something stronger than tea. I half expect Sophia to go find a bottle of something, but instead she simply takes a breath and continues. The girl at the center of it all saw her sister fall, leapt to her feet, and took off toward her, wailing in grief. She got 2 steps away from her sister's body when the guard fired a second arrow, taking the older sister in the back. Not enough to kill her, but enough to leave her gasping and dying in the dust. That's when a guard, the fool in charge of these uniformed barbarians, screamed out an order. He said, "Take every single woman of the village into custody. Every girl, every child. Take them all." The men of the village weren't going to stand for that, of course. They tried to fight back. They charged the guardsmen. Sophia quietly shook her head. But what are farm tools and iron rods against well-trained men with steel? Even outnumbered 10 to 1, the guardsmen began a slaughter. They simply began killing. They began killing everyone, whether they came at them armed or not. Sophia swallowed and her voice shook slightly. I quickly pull my Sonia back toward our house, restraining her physically and mentally, pushing out the idea that we must live. Above all else, we must live. We can fight back later, maybe escape, but to do that, we must first live. So, we do not fight back. We do not touch the magic. We do nothing to resist. We live. And Sonia stops struggling in my arms. We don't resist, even when 2 guardsmen pull us apart and shove me down in the dirt. Even when I watch my neighbors being killed in front of me. Some of the townspeople managed to run from the carnage. Many did, I suppose. How many actually made it out, I'm not sure. I watched one family try to barricade themselves in their house. A guardsman simply doused the front of the house, put it to the torch, and let it burn. I never saw if the family made it out of the house or not. I did see a friend of mine holding her injured little boy. A few years younger than Sonia, he was a dear playmate of hers. She was a sweet lady, and I could hear Sonia wail as my neighbor and her son were both cut down with the sword. Sophia is staring off in the distance now, cheeks wet with tears. I noticed Dara staring at the floor. She's already heard this unbelievably sad story before. Tam and Cressa, who have not, are staring at Sophia, and their cheeks are wet with tears of their own. By the end, they marched 20 of us out of the village. I have no idea how many of the others died and how many escaped, but there had been over 120 men, women, and children in the village. Now we were only 20, all of us women and girls, most much younger than me. And as we marched away, hands shackled, we could smell the smoke. Our village was being burned to the ground. Only one of the 12 guardsmen had been killed, another injured. Those were their losses. Our losses were every single thing and every single person we had ever known in life. Except I still had my second daughter, my granddaughter, my last living family member, and I was still alive. I sniff away my own tears. I take a long, ragged, shaky breath. God Almighty. I exhale and say, Sophia, I can appreciate how difficult it must be to retell that story, but I'm not sure how it connects with us or with the message you have to give me. Sophia wipes away her tears and gives me a sad smile. That's because this is only the first part of my story. Have you ever heard of a place called Grail?